Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am Jessica. I am your host today, and I am here with the author who wrote a book that everybody is going to be talking about. I definitely think people are going to have a lot of fun with this one. It is called Love Letters to a Serial Killer, and you are Tasha Coryell, correct?
Yes, that is me.
It's you. Yes, this is who I am speaking to. Yeah, this was a really fun book. And I would very much like to talk to you about where the idea came from, and how it all got started for you.
Yeah, so originally it started as a short story. And at the time, I had been reading a lot of older true crime. So, like Anne Rule's work about like Ted Bundy. And one of the really famous things about Ted Bundy is that he impregnated someone during his trial, which logistically, like, there are a lot of questions to begin with, but just like logistically, how does that happen? And so I was really fascinated by this idea of like people who fall in love with men who've been accused of doing really bad things. And it seems like it's really common for this to happen. And so originally in the short story, my sort of premise was like, well, what if you fall in love with someone who's been accused of being a serial killer, and then they turn out to be kind of like boring and ordinary? Like that would be so disappointing, right? Because you don't like fall in love with a serial killer because you're like, oh, but what if he's a good guy? Like you kind of want him to be a serial killer. And so I wrote this short story. I think that was probably back in like 2016 or something like that. And I kept thinking about it. And I was like, I'm going to write a novel based off this premise. And I was like, I have no time to write a novel right now. Like at the time, I was teaching full time, I was in a PhD program, but I was just like really motivated by this idea. And that's sort of where it was born.
Yeah, it was definitely a very interesting book, and a lot of characters making some really poor choices, and you kind of wonder like why. So the main character is Hannah, and she is unlucky in love and a lot of other things too. Uh, she she seems to have like some really interesting trouble making certain connections, and things don't necessarily go the way that she wants, and then she becomes sort of obsessed with this true crime story of the moment, which is William's many supposed murders, alleged murders, whatever you want to say. uh and then she begins making choices that are super super poor, more poor than stalking your ex on Instagram, which she does do. But I mean, we've all been there. We've all been in the position where we have an ex that is moved on, and every now and then we peek at their Instagram and we're just like, darn it. And hopefully people move on and they figure out that that's unhealthy. But for Hannah, she seems to kind of delve into the unhealthy. So do you want to just talk a little bit about her and like her whole deal, where she came from?
Yeah. So, in thinking about her, I was really thinking about like the overall like millennial condition. So when I graduated from college, I graduated in 2010, so directly into the recession. And that was really challenging because a lot of people I knew, and like myself included to some degree, we had been like successful up until that point in our lives. And then all of a sudden, we graduated into this world that was not the world that was promised to us. And that's really hard. Like, I think people like to make fun of millennials for being like entitled or lazy, But I think it's challenging when you grow up and everyone's like, oh, you're gifted. Like, you're going to do so much. What do you want to be? And then you're like, you think you're this person. And then you get into the world where you're sort of underpaid, you're underappreciated. People are treating you like you can't really do anything. And meanwhile, you're just getting like pummeled in the dating world. So like I have a lot of friends who I think are very intelligent, kind, compassionate people, and they date the worst dudes. And I'm like, they're not like serial killers, but I think they are bad, right? Like they might have like beliefs that are bad or treat other people poorly or treat my friends poorly. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, surely you can find someone better than this. And they're like, no, but I love him. And I sort of feel like there's a link between like the more hopeless things feel in your life as a whole to like dating these men who maybe provide some weird sort of validation, even if they're horrible.
That's actually a very interesting point. And I think, another thing that kind of came up was that like Hannah has a best friend who is in a very different place relationship wise. And there is like that unspoken competition that you have, like especially, and I'm not going to say it doesn't exist anymore. It certainly existed when I graduated college, and just in general, for women, like you need to be at this point at a certain age, and if you haven't passed these benchmarks, clearly you're never going to pass them. So I do think that sometimes, like when a friend, a very close friend, passes that benchmark and for instance gets engaged, it's almost jarring to somebody who's not anywhere near that because they feel like they're being left behind. Um, and I think Hannah definitely feels that way. Her job is also not particularly thrilling, for sure. And there just seems to be like this appeal, like with the whole Williams situation, when she starts reading about his case and, everybody's talking about it. And it gives her this weird sense of community. But then she goes like one step further and starts communicating directly with him, which is a whole other thing altogether.
Yeah. So one of the things I thought of is like I'm 36. So I have like most of my friends, I would say the majority of my friends are married, but I have a couple of friends that are still single and I'm married too. And like one of the things that they've talked about is how like things really changed for them on like dating apps and stuff when they turned 30. So like even though I think that there isn't necessarily the same kind of explicit pressure that there maybe used to be to meet these benchmarks at a certain time, I think it definitely still exists. And I think it's interesting how on like social media and like TikTok and stuff, there's sort of like this trad wife content that's going on where people are sort of like glorifying this very like hyper conventional lifestyle, and it's almost like that pressure is returning, like it's like cyclical, right? Like it's like, oh no, like you can do what you want, like women have these freedoms, and then one by one these freedoms are like being taken away, and it's like, why don't you just go back to the house? And so like I think like no matter what you believe, I think it's really difficult to fully escape from those sort of social conventions.
Most definitely it is. Yeah. So William himself, the supposed alleged serial killer, has a following, and it's not just Hannah. Uh, how much research? Because you said, you mentioned that, there seems to be a thing about women falling in love with serial killers and writing to serial killers. So how much research did you do into that? And how did you know like who William was when you started kind of writing about him, and how Hannah was going to sort of communicate with him.
So I didn't actually do that much research into people who love serial killers. Um, but I did, so I live in Minnesota now, but I lived in Alabama for 11 years because I went to grad school there. And that's sort of the geographical journey that she takes in the book too. She's in Minnesota and then she goes to Georgia. Um, and I was especially interested because I think that this is something I really commonly saw in Alabama is there would be women that I really liked who were like, had beliefs similar to mine. And then they would end up with these like very conservative men from like wealthy families. So I really based William off of that archetype. And I think that everywhere, but like especially in places like Alabama or Georgia, it still very much functions on like this good old boy system where it like who your father is really impacts how you're treated in society. And so I wanted to create a character who's in one of these families and he has all this pressure to live a specific life. And then he's accused of being a serial killer. And what that does.
Did you know where things were going to go in the book before you started writing it? Like it's one of those fun books that sort of ends, or rather begins towards the end, and then sort of it loops back in on itself and shows you how you got there, how Hannah got there. Were you like, did the twists and turns come first, or did you ride them out with the characters?
No, I wrote it out with the characters. I am not a huge, usually when I write a book, I have like a premise that I start with, and then I sort of explore things. And then sometimes things change in various drafts where I'm like, oh, well, I tried this and it didn't work. So I was writing and I was like, oh, I don't know what I want. Because like on one, like I myself have never fallen in love with a serial killer or anything like that. I have like a very nice husband. Like everyone who meets my
That's
husband
what
is
they
like,
all say.
no, I
I'm
legitimately
kidding, I'm
have a
kidding.
really nice husband. When I started dating him, a friend who knew him was like, "Oh, you're dating the nicest person in the world." Like
That's awesome.
he really is so nice. But I sort of understand Hannah's attraction at a certain level in terms of like my fictional attractions. So like when I watch like TV or movies or read books, like I read a lot of like romantasy and I just like love the evil shadow daddy and like they've all killed a bunch of people and they sort of like skate over the fact that they've killed a bunch of people, right? Like you don't treat people in books like that as serial killers, but that's functionally what they are. They are killing people all the time. And like I in thinking about this book, I bring up like the Twilight series a lot, which I read as a teenager, but I thought I was like too cool to actually like. So I like liked it ironically. And now I'm an adult and I sort of have like unironically embraced it in like a silly way. Like I enjoy it, but I understand it's silly. But like Edward has killed a bunch of people and like, everyone wants Bella and Edward to end up together. So I understand this desire to be with like someone terrible who's done terrible things. So while I was writing, I was like, oh, well, like I want him to be this, like turn out to be guilty, but then at the same time, I don't know if that's what should happen. And so I sort of went back and forth. And Hannah in the book goes back and forth too, where she's like she can't decide if she wants to be with someone because she sincerely loves them or if she wants to be with him because she loves the idea of being with a killer.
Yeah, I got some of that, and I thought her interactions with the other, I don't even know, his other little fan base, which was a whole other story altogether, was very interesting. And I don't want to talk too much about them because I don't want to give too much of it away. But the other interesting thing in the story was like his family. You mentioned before that he comes from one of these really big, good old boy families, were also sort of interesting to read in general. I know now, obviously where they all kind of came from in your head. Um, but it was sort of fun to read and kind of figure out like where he fit in with them in general, and like see them through Hannah's eyes and sort of react as a reader, but you're watching everything unfold slowly. So it was a fun process.
Yeah, and I would say that like so Lauren and Dottie are the two main other groupies that she hangs with. So I actually have a friend, Lauren, that's very obsessed with true crime, and she knows that there's a character named Lauren in the book, but she hasn't read the book. So hopefully she likes it. But she is very obsessed with true crime, and so I had a lot of conversations with her about various cases before I was writing the book, which is why one of the characters is named after her. Um, and then Dottie is sort of an amalgamation of various women that I met in my time in Alabama. And she's supposed to be like pretty different from Hannah. But what I think is interesting is that they both are attracted to the same sort of person.
So are you going to be working on anything else after this book?
Yeah, so I'm actually working on the next book now. I'm on my like fourth-ish draft. I can't say too much about it at the moment. But I can say that there is definitely it's similar in that there is a romantic element to it, and there's also murder. So it still carries both of those components, but it has a very, very different protagonist than Hannah.
Excellent. And so what kind of books do you generally like to read?
Yeah. So when I was younger, I read a ton of literary fiction. And then I had a moment, it was around the time when my husband and I first moved in together. And we have all these books, and especially together, he writes nonfiction. So we both have a lot of books. And I was still getting my Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing. And I wanted something to read before bed because I read every single night before I go to sleep. And I was like, wow, we have so many books and I don't want to read any of them. And I love literary fiction, but on the daily basis, what I want to read are like thrillers and then like fantasy. But I'm more of a romantasy person. I'm not into like the high fantasy stuff as much. Like, I don't really care if they go to war or like sword fighting or ever or whatever. I just want them to have like, I don't know, like two fairies kissing.
Of
Yeah,
course.
so yeah, and that was the point. I think that was really pivotal to my writing too, because I just started like reading thrillers all the time. And I was like, oh, this is really what I enjoy. And sort of what I found is like, it's especially when things are really intense in like the world around me or intense in my personal life, it's like a really good way to escape. Like, I just want to think about like, who's the killer? Like, what's going on? I want to solve that mystery. Um, and so at that point, I got really into thrillers. And I really like really funny thrillers too. So like, I loved like My Sister, the Serial Killer. I really like the You series by Caroline Kepnes. And I think that her book series captures things that the television show doesn't. So I always tell people, I'm like, no, it's a book series too. And they're like, yeah, whatever. I don't care. Um, Right now I'm reading the Poppy War trilogy by R.F. Kuang, who wrote Yellowface, which was one of my favorite reads last year. So I've been going through all of her books. Yeah, so I'm a big thriller and fantasy person.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I'm a thriller horror. I'm starting to, I like sci-fi fantasy, but I absolutely veer more towards the weirder stuff. So I get it. I get what you're saying. I like watching high fantasy, but reading high fantasy is always, I don't know, it's not necessarily what works for me in fantasy. There needs to be a little bit more grounding if I'm reading it, and I need to connect with the characters first and the world second.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Well, this was great. I cannot wait to read what you have coming next. When does Love Letters to a Serial Killer come out?
It comes out June 25th, so really soon.
Excellent. Well, run to your local library, your bookstore, wherever you get your books. Check out Love Letters to a Serial Killer. We are really excited to hear more from you, Tasha Coryell. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.